told you, separation, history, just basic we discussed, right? So in this model, the data we are working with, as well as well as as the business. It represents the data we are working with as well as the business. Um, Actually, client side, it uses POJO mechanism, means plain old JavaScript objects, POJO. So that is what actually client side it uses POJO, plain old JavaScript objects. Actually, it follows ORM, object relational mapper. ORM is object relational mapper. So actually, which is a technique, that maps to business requirements instead of database, that maps to business requirements instead of database. So that is what actually the concept of ORM is, object relational mapper. So model represents the data as well as the business. That's what actually model is. Generally, client side data is maintained in model. Client side data is maintained in model. Model references. We generally have model references. In the model references, we store the data, we maintain the data. How to create such model references to store the data, maintain the data, that we will see. That is the important thing you need to know first. That is the concept about model. So technically, it contains the data and it represents the data. Next one is we have view. Actually, it describes the application. It describes the application UI, user interface. It is a template. It is a template that dynamically renders HTML. So view represents the UI, application user interface. Actually, it is a template that dynamically renders HTML. So technically, the view is in a client side view means it is HTML, the HTML pages. So user interface is view, right? Where you want to show the data, from where you want to allow interactions with the data. That is actually view. And controller, it describes controller. It is the core MVC component. It is the core MVC component. Controller is the core MVC component. It handles the overall application flow. It handles the overall application flow. So it manages the communication. it manages the communication between model and view. You can simply say that it comprises of application specific logic. So generally what happens is it accepts the user input and binds to model. It gets the data from model. It gets the data from model and binds to UI. All this is managed by controller. It is the main component in MVC architecture. All the interactions are managed by this controller. So in MVC architecture, controller plays the key role. Controller, we have a controller and we have a model and view. So model and view. Actually what happens, so the client request, usually it gets to the view. From the view, the request will be passed to the controller. Controller contains the logic. You can say in JavaScript based client side environment, it is like on click what should happen, on change what should happen, all the events and functions. And it will connect with the model. Actually usually client side data means it will be in a JSON form. Actually, this will come from server side technologies. That later we will see. Now model very important is model cannot in MVC architecture, one major problem here is model is just like business logic. That means model is just like business logic. One of the main problem is apart from providing data objects, model have no significance, in this framework. Model have no significance in this framework. That means apart from providing data objects, model have no significance in this framework. That means nothing but model's point is only providing the data objects. Model have no significance in this framework means model is not going to send anything to controller. Model is not going to send anything to view. Actually, model is just like a business logic, a business layer separate. So model cannot directly interact by itself with controller and view actually. So controller will pass the data to model. Controller is going to pass the data to model, and the controller collects the data from the model. Model will not send the data to controller. That means controller picks the data from the model, right? The model is not going to send the data to controller. Model just contains, that means it just contains data. So data is in model and it cannot send anywhere. So it will controller will collect the data from the model and it will pass the data to the view. This is rendered as an output to the client. Sorry. That is the basic approach actually happens in a general framework. So that is the basic approach generally